Welcome to States and Migration in Europe. Today we are diving into a critical issue gripping the UK and sparking global debate, the recurrence of anti-immigration riots. This summer, violent protests erupted across multiple British cities, fueled by growing divisions over immigration policy. Our guest today is Professor Randall Hansen, a renowned migration historian and author of the recent book War, Work and Want: How the OPEC Oil Crisis Caused Mass Migration and Revolution. He offers a historical perspective that helps us understand why these riots recur and what makes Britain particularly susceptible to them. In this episode, we will start by exploring Hansen's journey into migration studies and his approach to researching these contentious topics. We'll then delve into the recent riots, tracing the roots back through British history, from the Notting Hill riots of the 1950s to the National Front marches of the 1970s. We'll ask whether there is something unique about Britain's relationship with immigration, and discuss the role racism plays, whether it is a core issue or a symptom of deeper concern. So, Randall, welcome, and thank you very much for being here with us.
Well, thank you for having me.
All right, so let's start with your own background in this questions. How did you come to study migration? You are a migration historian, but not only. You have published prominent books also about World War II. And so how did you come to study migration topics, and how do they fit within your broader production?
Yeah, thanks very much. Well, as I say in the preface to War, Work and Want, it was not for the best of intellectual reasons. When I was doing my doctoral work at Oxford, I got a scholarship for international relations, and I was in comparative government. So I began desperately thinking of a topic that was international, and I came to the stunning conclusion that since migrants cross borders, that was international and fit the rubric of the scholarship. So the original reason was rather anodyne. What interested me, though, about the UK originally is how it was that a country that was generally skeptical of migration, at least the public, kept an open door to what was the British Empire, the Commonwealth, for 14 years. And that was kind of my starting point into the field. In terms of the
just sorry to interrupt
yeah,
you. Say 14 years. So which years? 1945.
That was from 1948, the British Nationality Act of 1948, which created citizenship of the United Kingdom and colonies, the first British citizenship. Yeah, and so it was an open door to 400,000 people. Yeah. I quote an excessively high figure in my book, but it's been revised downwards, 400,000 people for 14 years.
I see. So I interrupted you. So
no.
We're interested in how the UK remained open for 14 years.
Yeah, precisely. But the method, as you say, is historical. So generally in all my work, I think most contemporary questions are best elucidated and explained historically. So within War, Work and Want, for example, I begin with a puzzle. There's all sorts of reasons that immigration should have tapered off in the early 1970s. The guest worker programs ended. The Americans restricted Mexican immigration. The global economy tanked, yet it tripled in absolute terms. Why? But I'm also very much interested in contemporary migration policy and how we can get it right, because Europe needs migrants, as I'm sure we would both agree. And for the moment, the far right is making hay on the back of demonizing immigrants. So we're in a very, very dangerous time.
So to sum up your interest in those questions, so you are interested in international matters, broadly speaking, and then you developed a genuine interest of Britain remaining open for 14 years to Commonwealth immigration. So which was a foreign policy puzzle. And you also wanted, and you are also interested in the salience of migration topics in the present, and you apply the historical method to understand the present. So I mean, for those of our listeners who don't know so well the field, I mean, you you have been writing on this topic for a very long time, and I find articles of you from so, such a long time ago, in which that are still very much useful for understanding these matters. So you are really the reference on the way Britain uh, was open and then got close to immigration from the Commonwealth. So that's an interesting puzzle. And how does these topics fit into your broader production? Because you have been interested in other international relation questions.
Well, I mean, I started a love affair with Europe when I arrived in 1992, and that's now been going on for over 3 decades. So I'm
Mhm.
interested in post-war European history, European politics generally. I teach it here at the University of Toronto. But I suppose that which links all of my work is an interest in outcomes that should not have happened, but did. So we mentioned the British keeping an open door to hundreds of thousands of people for 14 years, transforming the UK from a white into a multicultural country. Why? I did some work on forced eugenic sterilization, which did not end with the Holocaust and the Nazis, but actually increased in the post-war period. Why? My book on Germany looks at the bombing of civilian populations in World War II, which became its most intense and most murderous when we, the Allies, knew it wasn't working. Why? And then, as I say, most recently, immigration should have tapered off or even fallen in 1973, and global migration has gone straight up. Why? So, in a sense, that those puzzles pique my interest, and then the books follow.
Mhm. Yeah, very interesting. So why things happen that should not have happened? And
Exactly.
so okay, let's take this on migration or topic. So yeah, immigration is a contentious issue in Britain, but what you say that Britain shouldn't have remained open for so long, and yet it did. Yeah, I remember a quote from you from one of your work in which you highlighted. I think you were saying that how is it possible that a country uh, like Britain remained open to a setting that included, if I remember well, 400 million people. So we were in a big demographic imbalance and yet an economic imbalance at the same time. And so, according to you, it was necessary that there should be restrictions to immigration from the Commonwealth in the UK. It was necessary. It's a necessity triggered by demographic imbalances. Correct?
Um, well, I mean, on that going, I mean, you're taking me back a few decades. That was my first, my first book. But yeah, I mean, absolutely, that was the puzzle. You have this small country of uh, I have to go back, but about 40 million people, 50 million people at the time, that keeps itself open to, I think I said hundreds of thousands. You're right, hundreds of millions of people when there was clear evidence that the British public didn't want it, and frankly, the British politicians didn't want it for 14 years. So why would you keep an open border to all these people from the empire and what became the Commonwealth, 400 million people, for 14 years? That was my starting point. And we could talk about the answer, but I don't want to put your
Yeah,
readers to sleep.
let's do that. Let's talk about the answers. That is, my, uh, uh, as far as I know, British policy on immigration toward the Commonwealth, I have the feeling that whenever they try to close, they also triggered an influx. It has been well documented in the case of the Netherlands with Suriname when the Dutch stopped free movement with Suriname. They triggered a massive influx of um, inhabitants from Suriname who just had to take this right before it elapses. And you have also published, I think, an article on on the 1972 Uganda story, in which the UK also tried to close this door. And by closing the door, it triggered an influx of people who wanted to come precisely before the door gets shut. So sometimes deadlines are action forces. And when you create a deadline after which it will no longer be possible to come, you also create the influx. So do you think that the influx was coming on its own, and to some extent British policy managed to reduce it, or do you think British policy also triggered the influx?
Um, in a sense, both. I mean,
Hmm.
almost. I mean, there's three types of migration to Europe. There's family migrants, there's economic migrants, and there's asylum seekers, refugees. But to my mind, the most important in all of that, and the one that often explains the other two, is labor migration. So everywhere in Europe, in the United Kingdom, in France, in Germany, in Austria, in Sweden, in the Nordic countries, migrants came to for jobs to satisfy labor demand originally. And what I argue in War, Work and Want is that we fail to recognize the extent to which the middle and upper middle classes in Europe, but across the globe, are dependent, structurally dependent for their standard of living on an army of cheap migrant labor. So Commonwealth migrants to the UK came for work in construction, in the health service, in transportation, in industry. Um, Imperial citizenship was really the mechanism through which they
Yeah.
came, because there was this
Okay.
open door. But imperial citizenship as such didn't bring them. They came for jobs.
Mhm.
What you were talking about, referring to, was the beat the ban rush in 1962 or in 1968, when rumors circulated about controls on East African Asians from Kenya. In both cases, you had a big upsurge in migration. But we know everywhere that rumors of impending control will lead to more immigrants. And two, when you shut the door, as continental European countries learned when they ended the guest worker programs, you actually often get more migration, because where you have relatively open channels and where people know they can believe they can come back, they will go home, secure in the knowledge that if they need to come back to the country they immigrated to, they can. If you say it's over, done,
Mhm.
A, you'll have a rush before the deadline. B, anyone who is in will dare never go home. And of course, they'll bring their families. So that's the story of how the French, the Germans, the Swiss, the Austrians got exactly what they didn't want in the 70s and 80s, which was more, not less, immigration after you ended the guest worker scheme. And that happened because you can't actually block family reunification, and you can't deport, and nor should you, obviously, morally. But even if you wanted to, legally, the courts would never allow the mass deportation of legal residents in Europe.
Mhm. So yeah, I mean, so on the one hand, you consider that public authorities had a role to play to limit this influx, but on the other hand, you acknowledge how tricky it is to manage the movement of people, because you end up with a lot of unintended consequences, and the instruments you apply in order to reduce the influx also contribute to making it to increasing it in the short run, and perhaps also in the long run, because as you say, anytime someone has managed to get in, they will never get out, because they know how difficult it is to get in. So even in the long run, we can wonder whether the immigration restrictions do work. And I was referring also to your recent article in the Journal of Migration History on the Ugandan Asians
Mm-hmm.
in 1972. But this is the same story, than the other ones. So yeah, it's a tricky case to manage migration. And as you say, I fully agree with you on that. That the key mechanism is economic, and you can have an institutional mechanism such as imperial citizenship that facilitates the coming of those people. But then when you start moving to restrictions, you end up, it's not clear cut that, okay, we have imperial citizenship that can come easily. We move to restrictions, we close the door. No, because when you move to restrictions, you have these unintended consequences, which make all the problem tricky. But now let's go back to the present, because it is something
Yep.
also you mentioned. That is, the summer was out in the UK. And for someone like you, it rings many bells. So there were anti-immigrant riots based on murder that occurred during the summer. And it turned out that, against what was believed at the beginning, that murderer was, I don't know if he has been convicted yet. I have not followed the details, but at least in this, at the time of the event, the main suspect, let's say, was not an immigrant. His parents were from Rwanda, but he was not an immigrant himself. So already there was some tricky aspect, because there was some anti-immigration sentiment that occurred following this terrible event. But the main suspect turned out not to be an immigrant. And then the riots targeted uh, Muslim sites, immigrant housing, and so on. So this is the main problem also with riots. So I think my impression is that there is some British specificity here. There is anti-immigration violence in other countries, but I have the feeling that it's in the UK that we have this pattern of anti-immigration violence the most. In France, which is the case I know best, it's not so common. It has been very much highlighted in Germany, but at the end of the day, if you look at the numbers, they are not so significant. They are not so significant. In the UK, I don't think there are no pogroms in the UK, obviously, but there is this pattern of anti-immigration riots and violence dating back to the late 1950s. So, would you like to make a bit of history of this movement, and tell us also why you think it occurred, and if you agree with me, whether it's British specificity or not?
Yeah, I do and I don't, to give you a waffling answer. I mean, on the issue of the pogrom, it got pretty close this time, in the sense that when a Sudanese cafe owner is hunted down and right-wing thugs are shouting, "Where is Mohammed?" and he escapes and then comes back the next morning to find his cafe and his flat above burned to the ground. I mean, they probably would have killed him if they could have. Let's break
This was
this.
this summer.
This was this summer, yeah,
Yeah.
in Belfast during the week of
Okay.
riots.
Okay.
But let's not break that out a bit. In a sense, the two main anti-immigrant or anti-black or anti-people of color riots were 1958 in Notting Hill and Nottingham, and this summer in 2024. There have been many other riots in the United Kingdom. Think of 1981 in Brixton or in
Yeah.
Liverpool, 2011, quite similar to now, riots all across the United Kingdom, again in the summer. In those other three cases, or 2001 in Bradford, they were either, so 1981 and 2011 were reactions to police brutality. So they weren't anti-immigrant or anti-black riots as such. They were actually frustrations within racialized communities that boiled over. And 2001 in Bradford was, like 2005 in Birmingham, almost gang violence, fights between communities, Asian and white in Bradford, and black and Asian um, in Birmingham. And of course, if we want to talk about riots generally, think of France in 2005, or think of Hamburg, the G20 in 2017. There have been 2,000 attacks on refugees or hostels in Germany since the mass arrival of refugees in 2015, in 2016. So I'm not sure they're a British specificity, except insofar as there have been these two defining acts of popular violence against migrants, not against migrants, against people of color in 1958, again and again in 2024. I was reflecting on France, but there some of the most egregious attacks on North African populations have been actually orchestrated by the police.
When in France?
Oh, I was afraid you were going to ask me that. It was in the early 1960s when some Algerian protesters were pushed into the Seine, and then at one subway stop, one metro stop, were actually killed. 61, 62, but I would have to fact check the date on that.
No, it's I think it's October 1961. It's
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah.
It's in the context of the Algerian War, and
Yeah.
so there was a demonstration of Algerians
Exactly.
supporting the FLN, and the police reacted strongly
Yeah.
with bodies
Murderously.
ended up in the River Seine, and we don't know the number of deaths. But that, if I may, is a bit of a special case. It's not an anti-immigration riots. It's more of a war war getting transferred from Algeria to the mainland of France. It's there is a foreign contagion here. It's not endogenous to the immigration process, I think, whereas other riots, for instance, the one this summer in the UK, are a simple reactions by natives, or sometimes, yes, you're right, the police against immigrants as immigrants. In 1961 in France, it was a political demonstration in the context of a war, which is slightly different. And but where I think there is some British specificities that you have large-scale riots against immigrants, whereas in France you have riots that involve immigrants, that's for sure, but against them it's not so common. It's not so common. Whereas in the UK, for instance, what happened this summer, it's I fail to see that in the French context. It's, as you said, well, it's more common in the German context. But the difference in the German context, I think, is that these are very targeted events. So they target one immigrant building, whereas in the UK, these are full-blown riots at the same time. Do you agree with this distinction?
No, I see exactly what you're saying. You're absolutely right about France. And since that was the kind of point I was making, that the example we have in France was state-led, effectively, not from below. We do have these two standout instances of 1958 and 2024, where across the country in 2024 and in two cities in 1958, gangs of white thugs went out to harm and kill people of color. And in 1958, they proudly said, "We are going on N-word hunts." So those definitely occurred. Two comments on that. One, I don't want to lump in all the other riots we've had in the United Kingdom, because 1981 in Brixton and Liverpool was very much like 2005 in the suburbs of France. Point one. Point two, I tend to be highly suspicious of arguments that talk about national specificity, because I tend to think they're a road to nowhere. The reverse side of this that you get a lot in the United Kingdom is this incredible self-congratulatory rhetoric about what a wonderfully multicultural society the United Kingdom is, and we've defeated racism here. There's a bit of kind of underlined anti-European sentiment. It's so much better to be a racialized minority in London than in Paris or in Berlin. And people of color themselves will make these arguments in the United Kingdom. I was on a panel in London in June where everyone was patting themselves on the back on how the UK had got it right. And then 6 weeks later, we had these horrendous riots. So on the one hand, I think there's very little justification for saying the UK gets it right more so than any other country in Europe, and you hear that all the time. On the other hand, I wouldn't say that the UK suffers from a particular affliction that you don't have in other countries. You're right in a sense; they might have been more targeted, but there are attacks um, on refugees, on asylum seekers, on POCs in Germany fairly often. There was a series of murders in the 2010s of people of Turkish Germans that went unnoticed by the police for years and years. What you might say about the UK is this particular form of really thuggish street violence. You do see there more. And in that sense, the football hooligans, who are incidentally precisely the same demographic as the anti-immigrant rioters, that's a problem you have in the UK that you didn't have elsewhere in Europe.
Yeah, and we were also discussing this picture at some point. It's from the 1970s, precisely at the time of these expulsions of, these movements of Asians from Africa in the early 1970s. And this is a National Front march in, I think it's near London. And here you see the motto is Britain for the British. Enoch is right, in reference to Enoch Powell, stop immigration. And so this is not direct physical violence, but when you have events like that, yes, you prepare the ground also for actual violence and the type of thugs that you used to mention. I think in France in the 1970s there was a lot of xenophobia. That's indisputable, but I don't think it could escalate into so direct demonstrations of xenophobia like this one in the UK. That's why I was thinking that Britain is a bit special, and
Okay. Yeah, you're determined not to let the British off the hook here. All right, let's.
I want to elucidate this point. Until that's my last bullet, and then we will be gone on this.
No, fair enough. So let's go back. So this was April 1968, and I'm glad you brought this up because there's a very important link between 68 and 1972. And this was the Kenyan Asians crisis, not the similar Ugandan Asians crisis of 1972, but they're very easy to confuse. So what happened there is that large numbers of East African Asians with British passports, and a right to enter the United Kingdom, were escaping racism in Kenya. And in the midst of all of this, Enoch Powell gives a speech in which he calls black children, I don't want to repeat it, but he uses awful racist terms to describe black children. He accuses black people of pushing excrement through the doors of white people, which was disgusting and almost ironic in the sense that black and Asian people frequently had excrement pushed through their doors in these years, the 1960s and the 1970s. And he famously ended it saying, I, like the Romans, see the river Tiber foaming with much blood, arguing that all this unwanted black and Asian immigration would lead to civil war, kind of Elon Musk before his time. He was sacked by the conservatives, but you're right, it led to these massive white working class protests of support and violence. Black and Asian people were attacked, were afraid to be on the streets. Children wouldn't go to school. It was awful. So what's the link with now? Well, in both cases, politicians who should have known better deliberately whipped up sentiment. Powell is obvious. 2024 is less obvious, but what were the chants of those white right-wing thugs, those racist thugs? British for the British, easy enough, get them out, that sort of thing, and stop the boats. Well, stop the boats was a phrase invented or at least popularized by the Conservative Party and by Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, ironically Britain's first Asian MP. And the Conservative Party, entirely incorrectly, created the impression that those arriving on boats are illegal. They are not illegal migrants. They are asylum seekers. It's perfectly legal perfectly legal to come to a country illegally and claim asylum. If you're a refugee, how you arrive is utterly irrelevant. So we don't know if they're legal or illegal until their case is processed. He called them illegal, promised to stop the boats, and rather than simply rather than simply processing quickly the asylum seekers, he generated a political crisis and handed fodder to the far right. So Enoch Powell is dead, but Rishi Sunak and the Tory party should be hanging their heads in shame, though I rather suspect they're not.
So you consider that if there is a British specificity, it has to do with the way some politicians orchestrate these questions, perhaps more bluntly
Yeah,
than in
exactly.
other
Well,
countries.
I'll let you call it a specificity. I don't like, as I said, I don't like national
You don't.
specificities. But
Okay.
what does link the two cases is that you had the political elite, senior politicians, respectable
Hmm.
upper middle class or upper class politicians saying to the racists, "It's okay, you're right to think what you
Hmm.
think."
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, but
Yeah.
again, Helmut
Yeah.
Kohl did something very similar. I mean,
Okay. Okay. So
he
you
used
think
this.
it's a pattern of politicians, including very prominent ones,
Well,
across perhaps Europe.
I think where prominent politicians, particularly of the center, not so much of the far right, we expect
Yes.
Nigel Farage and Marine Le Pen to spout their racist nonsense, or Höcke in Germany, but where mainstream centrist politicians spout racism, they encourage violence. So the attacks in Germany on German Turks, the burning of houses, the killing of Turkish Germans, that the attacks also on asylum hostels in Germany, that followed Helmut Kohl's ramping up of the rhetoric about asylum seekers. The boat is full. There are too many people here. So rather than doing what politicians are bloody well paid to do, which is to deal with the problem, they shifted onto minorities, onto refugees, whip up racist sentiment, and then do, oh my God, do this, express shock when people are hurt and killed. Well, it's your fault.
All right. Yeah. So we are entering now into the core of the discussion. That
Mm.
is, how do we explain this violence? So let's turn the page now on any national specificity, while still talking about what has happened in the UK last summer, and let's try to explain that. So I understand that there are two. We have referred possibly to two explanations. I am not saying that it must be one of the two that is correct, but one explanation is racism. Is it the end of the story? That is, people are racist, and that's it. That's why you have anti-immigrant violence. Uh, Full stop. Uh, I don't think this is the correct answer. And the alternative is you have key policymakers that orchestrate hatred or resentment between racial groups. And so they are also very much at the root of these racist behaviors. So, how do you relate to this alternative? Do you see other types of explanation, or you pick one of the two in this alternative?
No, I mean, there are multiple, clearly, there's almost always multiple factors. Racism is obviously a big part of it. These were racist, shouting racist slogans, threatening, trying to burn down mosques and hotels where asylum seekers are housed. So racists, Islamophobes. If it looks like a racist, talks like a racist, walks like a racist, it's probably a racist. Fine, but that's not the whole story. We talked about political responsibility already. That definitely played a role in these riots. But there's also other triggering mechanisms, and that is rumors. So, as you said, the rumor was put out on social media and quickly retweeted multiple times that the murderer was a Muslim asylum seeker when he was a Christian British national. In other cases, the rumors went out as well. So in 1981 in Brixton, Michael Bailey, a black resident of Brixton, died in police custody of wounds inflicted not by the police. The rumor went out that the police killed him. In Liverpool, in Toxteth, the police chased down a black man, arrested him. Rumors that he was beaten up, maybe killed, beaten up for sure, circulated. So these rumors very, very often lead to violence. Often they're gendered, so a rumor that a particular member of a community raped a white woman, that will create a rumor which spreads and which leads to violence. What's of course different about 2024 is that social media allows these incorrect rumors to spread like a wildfire, and allows nefarious actors like Elon Musk to join in. Now, I came off Twitter when Elon Musk bought it. Frankly, it mystifies me that any progressive can remain on X. But anyway, I'm off. From what I've read, this spread like a wildfire. But there's another factor, and let's be very careful here. There's a fundamental difference between an oppressed minority, black people in Britain in the 1980s, or black people in France in 2023, rebelling against racism, and white people who are a majority and who have privilege attacking black people. They are not the same thing, and they can never be compared. But what one can say is that there's always underlying conditions. And while it's right, it was absolutely right in 1981 to look at deprivation in Liverpool and in Brixton, I think it's right now to think about socioeconomic deprivation, poverty in some of these communities. It doesn't explain Bristol or London, but in Newcastle and in Southport, in northern communities, and this is no surprise to anyone, there's poverty, there's unemployment, there's been a decline in services, and that should be addressed and dealt with. And that those frustrations no doubt played something of a role. And again, politicians have been terribly irresponsible here. They house asylum seekers for long periods of time in hotels in the poorest parts of the country. The huge failure is not to process them. And secondly, don't house them in the poorest parts of the country, which are kind of racist anyway, and don't house them in hotels, because that creates the impression, above all a hotel, that asylum seekers are getting this for a free ride. I can't afford a hotel for my holiday in Mallorca or even in Blackpool, and asylum seekers are being put up in a hotel. This is very foolish. And Germany, which isn't that much richer than Britain, manages to build refugee hostels for a much larger population. The British state has utterly failed to do this. And no German is going to say, goodness, I wish I lived in a refugee hostel. Does that make sense?
Yeah, we see the broad picture here of what's going on. I think first about racism, because you started with that, and yes, obviously you have racists, and racism is the imputation of a negative characteristic observed in a few to an entire phenotypical group. And this is at play. Obviously, it's undeniable. I am still on Twitter. I think that the level has gone down recently, but I am also doing that to observe, and I learn things in observing, and I do follow those accounts that report you have some accounts that are specialized on color people criminality.
Mhm.
So you have an account, they will report to you every criminal act a bit atrocious that has been perpetrated by a color person. And then you see, especially, I mean, the one I follow, they they try to be clear cut on that. And they are on this particular focus and they apply it, okay. But you see in the comments, racism at stake. That's undeniable. That is, then you have some people who follow that, and then they end up saying, okay, every black person, every Maghreb person is a criminal in incapacity. Is a criminal. So that's a clear pattern, and I do think there is something anthropological here. But there is also something more historical, that is something more specific to that, because you could also apply that to other categories. You could say, oh, most criminals are men between 16 and 35. Are we going to be anti-men between 16 and 35? It doesn't make sense. And it's the same, actually, regarding skin color or whatever it is. And so, but then is the question. I think those people who end up into that path, they are very much concerned, and this was the case of Enoch Powell as well. They are genuinely concerned that these foreigners are going to absolutely brutal. So whenever you have a conflict, each side is convinced to be the victim. They are convinced that they are threatened and that they are going to be massacred. Actually, the most powerful incentive for a massacre is to believe that you are going yourself to be massacred. So this is the pattern, and so they expose themselves to this violence, and then they become themselves butchers. But though the deep question here is there something wrong? And you mentioned socioeconomic issues. Is there something wrong? And here, I will take a position based on my understanding of the French case. Also, I do think there is a genuine immigrant criminality in France. And I have seen it myself as well. And you have some young people who are late teenagers, and they want also to fit a pattern. They want to fit a model in which I remember also there were some sources about the French projects in the early 1980s, and there was someone who was interviewed, and he was from this project. He was from the Maghreb, and he was saying, "Okay, now if you are 16 in the project and you have never stolen, there is something wrong with you. You are not normal." So you have these communities indeed, in which it has been normalized to steal, normalized to be violent sometimes, um, and so there is a pattern here. There is a pattern. I am not saying that they are all like that, but it's clear that for late teenagers in these particular suburbs, where there is a very big criminality, it's hard to resist and it's hard not to get involved into that. And then it leads the way to a broader categorization against these people. And so, I mean, you are free to disagree with me on that, but this is my view, and I have sources on that, both from my personal experience, but also the real historical sources, as I was mentioning, this testimony from the early 1980s. And so the question is, how did we end up there? Why is there a distinctive immigrant criminality? And here you mentioned some socioeconomic factors. My big take on that is that markets, especially labor markets, are not regulated for immigrants in most European countries. They are regulated for insiders, and especially the labor market. And many immigrants who arrive with no network or low skills, they have two options: the criminal option, which is going to pay them quite well comparatively, but is very risky. And the other option is a legal option, fully legal option, but there is no job. And so you see the alternative here, in which many, I mean, this alternative is basically the tragedy of the project in France, in which you have to be a dealer, you have to steal motos, cars, and whatever. And this is how you make money in the project. If you want a real job, good luck. You will not find one. You will send 100 CVs. They will tell you that probably it's because you are called Mohammed, but that also has its limitation because some employers are themselves Arabs. So, but it's just that market is not regulated for them, and so we know that whenever you have large scale unemployment, you have this tendency to go into the criminal sector. And so for late teenagers again, who feel strong and want adventures, it can be tempting as well to take this risk and to steal, to be a dealer, and so on. And then, we end up into this very difficult situation. But I talk too much.
No. I'm taking a few notes because there's a lot to cover.
And my last point on this, I
Yeah.
think, and it's perhaps an area of disagreement. I think this is the root cause of the problem. And Twitter and so on, and these things are amplification. I agree with you, but it's always better to go after the root cause rather than trying to forbid the smoke. We should,
And
yeah.
the root cause is migrant criminality, in your view, or
I think
minority?
the root cause is the market that is unfavorable to them,
markets.
which
Yeah,
leads them into this criminal sector, which
Yeah,
in
yeah.
turn, that's the overall pattern.
Yeah. Let me first come back to your rather plaintive defense of continuing to be on Twitter, though, Emmanuel. And I wrote a book years ago called Disobeying Hitler, which was on the German resistance. And one of the arguments people made after the war, when they said, "How could you possibly continue working from this regime?" For this regime, people said, "Well, if I simply resigned, if I didn't work for the civil service, judiciary, even more brutal instruments of the National Socialist regime, I couldn't stop anything. I couldn't resist from within." Your argument seems similar to me, and not wrong. The problem with leaving X is that you leave all this nonsense completely unchallenged. So in a sense, hats off to you. Let me deal with criminality. I don't know the French data, but I recently looked at the German data. And it is true, it's a fact, which migration scholars are generally progressives, and they want to pretend that everything is wonderful in the garden. And this is problematic. Yes, migrants, people with a migration background, as you say in Germany, commit more crimes, but the increment is small. About 10% of Germans commit crimes. The figure for people with a migration background is 15%. So you can spin that statistic to say it's 50% more, but in fact, it's a very small number of people for both groups. Much of this, and you've said this already, is the way in which we politicize this. So wife beating is incredibly common, spousal abuse, I should say, everywhere in Europe. Every woman faces a hard fact. They are most likely to be murdered by their husband or their partner. It's particularly rampant, for example, in Italy. And we do not get a narrative that says, except on the left and the far left, my God, we have a massive crisis of white men here or of masculinity. So how we frame these facts is not a politically neutral process, of course, and it's driven by a political agenda. And very often when there is crime, when there is violence, when there's murder, when there's domestic abuse committed by white Europeans, we say, they're freaks, they're losers, they're aberrations. When it's committed by people of color, then suddenly it's a structural problem. All of that said, I don't disagree that there's an issue here, and I think you are getting to the heart of it. One is the way in which labor markets and economies in France and in Southern Europe privilege insiders versus outsiders, and make it, have this tier of well-paid unionized jobs with defined benefit pensions, excessively generous ones, frankly, in Southern Europe, for one group of people, and everyone else is shut out. That includes lots of young white Italians, Spanish, Greeks, but disproportionately um, people of color, migrants and descendants from migrants. That's problem one. Problem two, and this is kind of the core of war, work, and want, Europeans are in denial of their structural dependence on low-skilled migrant labor. So if you come to Europe informally or as an asylum seeker, with some exceptions for asylum seekers, and that's the only way you can get to Europe, you don't have the right to work. And when you don't have the right to work, you work informally in meatpacking, domestic care, construction, and or you engage in criminality. And my interviews with NGOs in Rome a couple of years ago said exactly that. We need immigrants in Italy. We don't let them in. They come anyway. We exclude them from the labor market, and we give them no choice but working as sex workers or selling drugs, and then we condemn them for it. I think that's fundamentally part of the problem. And all European countries and the Commission need to recognize that Europe needs low-skilled migrants, and we have to open labor channels for them and tackle the problem by improving the nature of work. And if we improve the nature of work across Europe, and the British, to their credit, are trying this at the moment, then we won't face the trade-off that you rightly emphasize between lousy work, lousy pay, lousy conditions, and criminality. One more point. Another cause of the riots and of violence in general is, of course, toxic masculinity. Have a look at all the rioters. They're all white working class machismos. None of them seems very fluid to me. So there was an element of probably alcohol-fueled testosterone, in-group solidarity, the great fun men have in smashing things up, that explained 1968 and 2024 and the G20 in Hamburg and many other examples of thuggish violence.
Yeah, interesting. So we we have some areas of disagreements, but we have some area of convergence as well. And I am glad that we agree on this idea that the tragic alternative that some young immigrants or even sometimes descendants of immigrants are facing is we recognize both these tragic alternatives. That is, either you have a very hard time in legal work conditions, or you have this door of the criminal sector, which is also very pernicious.
And often informal work, illegal
Yes.
work. Yeah, that's your.
So that's this is where we agree, but I think that there is a lack of here is the core of the problem. In my view, here it's the core of the problem. And we were mentioning some politicians who were orchestrating violence against immigrants in some cases. I would push the argument that some of them may even be cynical, because they understand that the explanation in terms of racism, or the labeling racial groups are dangerous as such, is a way also to eliminate possible discussions on reforms that are extremely politically difficult for them and for the bureaucracy itself. You have programs that deal with a variety of issues, and if you were to solve the problems those programs deal with, you will get rid of the bureaucracy. And likewise, if you get rid of some regulations, this is not good. So I suspect that you have some policymakers who are deeply cynical about the matter, about the subject matter, and are, or even if they are not cynical, because the human mind is as it is, they tend to ignore things that are not politically viable and focus on things that seem to work politically. So here we have also a structural pattern of politics that is going to channel the problem into a special explanation. That is, we are going to channel our mind into a special explanation in order to avoid another one that is politically very contentious. Then, so I think this is the key problem, and it explains also why you have some policymakers that try to ignore this distinct immigrant criminality. You have, especially in the center or in the left, they will say, no, 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 nothing of all this happens, or they will be blind on all this, because if you open the eye on that, you have to find the cause. And if you look for the cause, you may find the solution. And you don't want to find the solution because it challenges a lot of the current political framework, a lot of current policies that that protect insiders. I mean, anytime you give rights to workers, to some extent, you make employment more difficult for the others. If you have to pay an immigrant from Sudan, I don't know, £2,000 a year, a month, you want to be sure that the immigrant can read, can perform certain tasks, and if you have doubts about that, you may not hire them. That's a fact. Many dispute it, I know, but that's a fact employers are faced with. So if you give rights to workers, it tends to benefit insiders, but it can be detrimental to outsiders. And so if you recognize then that there is a distinct immigrant criminality, it can lead you to recognize the unintended consequences of those policies. And many policymakers don't want really to do that, and they try to ignore the problem. And then there is the question about free speech in all that, and or what you call rumors. I don't think being on X is like being part of the Nazi Party in the 1930s. But I think also, even though I deeply disagree with some content, and sometimes I follow them, but I'm not going to challenge them because it's pointless. I am not going to reply to the racist and say you are racist. What is it going to happen? They will not care about what I say. This is not the point. But I think that if we want to suppress them, I think we need to address them indeed, perhaps not via Twitter, because Twitter, I tried to do it a few times and just it doesn't lead anywhere. Nobody pays attention because those accounts are followed by people who are racist, and that's it. You cannot really challenge them, but you can challenge them elsewhere. So those people, they may not listen to you on that particular thread, but they can listen to you elsewhere. For example, here as we speak, perhaps some people will listen to us, and you need to know what is their problem. You need to know what are their concerns if you want to talk to them. And again, I think you can only talk to them in a different medium, but you need to first listen to what they say, where they feel free to speak. And but if you just suppress them and prevent them from communicating, first of all, you miss the understanding of what they say, and also you miss yourself the capacity to really find the core of the problem. That's why I think not letting them talk is not helpful. But this is an area of disagreement, because you point to the fact that sometimes these rumors can have real world consequences. That's problematic indeed, but we must always go to the root cause of the problem. And why do we have this rumor in the first place?
Can I jump in on that?
Go on. Yes.
You've thrown a lot at me. Yeah, some interesting points. I mean, I think we want to nuance it a bit because you're suggesting something's a bit more binary than they actually are. So on the issue of labor markets, I think the issue is actually excessive job protection rather than wages. So where you have highly rigid labor markets where it's impossible to sack a worker once you hire them, surprise, surprise, firms will be very hesitant to take on permanent workers, which is the problem you have in France between the contrat déterminé and the contrat indéterminé. So one relatively simple thing to do is to make it easier to let workers go. And that hate figure, Emmanuel Macron in France, has actually substantially reduced unemployment with fairly modest changes. The left in parts of continental Europe hates this, but what they ignore is that in Denmark, for example, it is relatively easy to sack workers, but companies have an obligation to retrain them, and there's lots of state support for retraining, so they get back into Denmark's really quite dynamic labor markets relatively quickly. You can raise minimum wages much higher than the economists thought without leading to unemployment. That was a big myth and a lie. But there are trade-offs. And again, what I say in More Work and Want, the last book, is that the middle classes are structurally dependent on cheap migrant labor. What do I mean by that? Well, wages have stagnated since the 1970s. As Piketty and others tell us, this is true. But the price of most goods has fallen, and I show the data in the book, precipitously. Why? Well, there's an outsourcing story, there's an automation story, there's a technology story, but there's also, for labor-intensive industries that can't be sent abroad, construction, meat packing, for the textiles and garments industry that still exists in Europe, places like Prato in Italy, they've done it on the back of through debasing wages. So all of us are enjoying cheaper goods because the wage cost of those goods has declined. So if we raise that, all of us will have to get by with a little bit less and pay more for our products. And my friends on the left don't like this argument because this shifts responsibility away from states, who play a fundamental role, of course, to the consumer. On your point about cynicism, I mean, for the far right, that's all it is. The Alternative for Germany, the National Rally, Reform in the UK, they have no solutions to any of the problems. None. Their ticket to power is taking all the very real problems that we face in Europe, unemployment, inflation, stagnating growth, and they blame it all on immigrants. But you're also right that center-right politicians who know better, who know either that A, they'll have to offend some powerful clients by making the necessary changes, which is kind of what you implied, or B, in an era of low growth, we just can't have the sort of changes that we want, don't have the courage to say that, and they also allow immigrants to be scapegoated. On the issue of free speech, I mean, I don't fundamentally disagree, but again, there's a mid-range. The EU's efforts to regulate big tech, to demand the flagging of disinformation, to restore on X some very, very reasonable warnings when misinformation is used, all of which that fascist Elon Musk swept away. That can be done without damaging free speech. And there are a lot of people. I mean, it is not for a moment would I indict the white working class as the problem in Europe. We're talking about a tiny minority, a minority of them. You can reach all sorts of people, I think, through conventions, through talk shows, through focus groups, bringing together people with a migration background and white Germans or white French. And through classic speech mechanisms, we can make a difference. So not for a moment am I saying we should suppress this. It's impossible, even if we wanted to do it in an age of social media. It'll all just go to Telegram.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have a lot we agree with on the underlying labor regulation factors, the role. So yes, I'm glad that also we agree on cynicism, and I do share your view also that I mean, you have obviously people who believe what they say, in the far right crowd, but I do think you have some of them that at some point they are just cynical and they know that they are not going to solve any problem, and they go for the easy solution, what is going to work well among constituencies, all included. You don't want to alienate any kind of constituency except those who don't vote, those who don't care, and then it leads you mechanically to a certain path, and then it leads us as well to discuss and to think about the political system and the political regime that we want, the kind of institutions representation. But these are broader questions. I think yes, we need to stay on those common views, and perhaps we can discuss later on the rest. In another episode sometimes later. But it was very great to have you, and it was an honor to have you, Randall, in this episode to comment on the British case, and more broadly on the immigration predicament in Europe and as well in North America. We talked a bit about other parts of the world. Any last word? Any concluding thought on those developments or on your book? Where can so people cannot follow you on X, but where can they follow you also?
Well, I mean, I'm fairly easy to Google stock, but my website is also Randall Hansen .squarespace.com. But as I say, if they Google me, they'll find me quite quickly. The only last thing I guess I would say is we can't really give up the fight in this area. There's moments when I really want to give up. The far right is on the march on the continent. God help us, Trump might actually win in November. And one's tempted to retreat to what the Germans call inner migration, tend one's intellectual garden and get out of politics. But we have to stay in the game. And since you on X, me writing in other media outlets, and we have to fight to mobilize our research on immigration into digestible facts that counter the dominant narrative, which unfortunately is reaching a hysterical pitch of anti-migrant sentiment in Europe at precisely the moment when Europeans need migrants more than they ever have before.
Perfect. So thank you, Randall, and please stay tuned for another episode of the States and Migration podcast that will be released soon.
Thank you, Emmanuel.